Hi everyone. This past week, Americans watched as another anniversary of 9/11 happened. Most people born before the mid-90s all share something in common. They can tell you exactly where they were when they heard about the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001. The man I'm about to tell you about today would tell you that he was right there in Lower Manhattan, watching the attacks unfold. Adding an additional layer of complexity to taking in this event, he was a Polish immigrant who had been in the United States for less than a year. But he can't share his story with you, because just 20 minutes before the darkest day in New York City came to an end, he would be murdered and become the only homicide recorded in New York City on this day. So instead, I'm going to tell you his story, one so often overshadowed by the other events of that day, one so deserving of answers. This is A Simpler Time, True Crime, the murder of Henryk Siwiak. Henryk Siwiak was born in 1955 in Poland. He grew up loving science, though he didn't pursue it formally in any secondary education. He instead went to a technical school, but he did end up marrying a scientist. His wife Eva transitioned into being a high school biology teacher, while Henryk worked much of his career as an inspector for the Polish state railways. Together, the couple had a daughter, Gabriella, and a younger son named Adam. The Siwiaks had consistent work, but they were never super comfortable financially. And in the fall of 2000, things got pretty desperate. Henryk was laid off from his job, and Poland's economy was tanking. It had a 15% unemployment rate, so securing a new job after getting laid off was proving to be very difficult. His oldest child, his daughter, was getting ready to go off to college, and he wanted to provide her with the opportunity for a good secondary education. He thought about the path that his sister Luciana had taken. Luciana had owned a health food store in Poland, but she too had wrestled with the struggling Polish economy, and her store went under. She had come to the United States and found a home in Rockaway, a Polish community in Queens, New York. This was in the late 1990s, and Henryk thought maybe it would work out well for him too. So, in 2000, around fall time, he moved into the same neighborhood as his sister and began picking up odd jobs. It was working out quite nicely. Henryk worked so hard, and he would take any job that was available to him. He was often finding jobs under the table, and he was able to send half of his earnings back to Poland. He was making around $1,000 a month and keeping half. Most of this was temp labor jobs in construction. Henryk had difficulty learning English. Most of what he knew he picked up from watching TV. He had actually enrolled in school to learn English, but he never made it to that day. This didn't matter much in his local community because he was surrounded by other people who spoke Polish, so he felt like he fit right in. But it did present a problem sometimes when he was going in other parts of the city, and this does come up again later. Fast forward to September 11th, 2001. Henryk woke up like all other New Yorkers that day, planning another routine Tuesday. But as you already know, that wouldn't be the case. It was early morning when Henryk made his way to Lower Manhattan for his construction job. But at 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into floors 93 and 99 of World Trade Center's North Tower. By 9:03 a.m., hijacked Flight 175 struck floors 77 and 85 of the South Tower. Henryk bore witness to all of this, but he, like most people in real time, didn't even understand really what was going on. He was confused but temporarily safe and only knew enough to recognize that something big was going on. Of course, Normal life shut down in Lower Manhattan that morning and for the foreseeable future, and that meant that his construction site was closed down. But money was so tight, Henryk could not afford to lose out even on a day of work. His wife Eva described him in an interview to ABC News as, quote, a restless spirit. So he crossed the Brooklyn Bridge and made his way over to a Polish employment agency to help him find a new job. He had seen an ad in New York's Polish newspaper, Super Express, that said, "Men to clean stores in Brooklyn and Queens. English not necessary." When he got there, the woman running the agency was filled with anxiety. Her husband worked at the World Trade Center and had not contacted her since that morning. She remembered Henryk comforting her and trying to give her words of encouragement as she waited to hear from him. Just as a side note, this woman would later learn that her husband had died in the attack. In the meantime, though, the owner was trying to stay busy, and she found Henryk a job that could start that night. It was mopping and waxing floors at a Pathmark grocery store located at 1520 Albany Avenue in the Farragut neighborhood of Brooklyn. The employment agency told him that he was to meet a man named Adam in a white car at that location. They had never met, so Henryk told the agency that Adam should look for him in his favorite outfit, a camouflage army surplus jacket and matching pants. He had picked them up at a thrift store, and his sister said he loved them very much and found them to be comfortable, so it wasn't uncommon to see him walking around in them. I actually have a picture of him just a week before his murder wearing them, sitting down in his kitchen, and you can find that picture in our Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod. Relieved that he had secured employment for that night, he made his way back to his apartment where he phoned Eva. It was early afternoon by this point in New York City and into the evening in Poland. He let Eva know that he had witnessed the second plane hit the building, but he still really wasn't sure what was going on. He had a TV in his apartment, but it was broken, and new information was coming out so fast. Eva and her son had seen the news of the attacks on TV, and they were both extremely worried. So you can imagine their relief when they received a phone call a couple of hours later hearing the words, "I'm okay." Eva later said in an interview with journalist Billy Jensen, quote, "Oh, it was horrible. We thought about our own husband and father. We were very happy when he called us," end quote. While they were on the phone, Eva filled him in on the full situation. She shared later in an interview that she felt that Henryk didn't really understand the gravity of what was happening and how significant it all was. Henryk also got on the phone with his son and comforted him. A few hours had passed between the time that the Siwiaks had found out about the terror attacks and had heard from Henryk, and so the boy was very, very worried about his father. Henryk got back on the phone with Eva. He let her know that he had secured work and was starting a new job that night, and he gave her all the details. But Eva had a bad feeling about it. She had long said to him for a while that the United States and New York City in particular could be dangerous, and that she worried about him living there. She also said on this date in particular, she worried that the unrest from the events earlier in the day could create an even more unpredictable and dangerous environment. She begged him not to go out that night, but she said there was no talking him out of it. He got off the phone with his family and grabbed his subway map to plan out how to get to where he was going that night. Nowadays, most of us navigate a situation like this with GPS on our phones. We may still need to follow a subway map to know which stop to get off at, but the rest of it is just a walk with a robotic voice telling us to turn left in 150 feet. But Henryk wasn't familiar with the area and didn't have GPS to guide him, so he asked a woman in his building for help in knowing how to get to the grocery store to meet Adam that night. Some sources say it was just a woman living in his building, and some say it was his landlord, so I'm not really sure which one is correct. I've seen it both multiple times. The two looked at the subway map together, And he hadn't given her the exact address. He had just told her Albany Avenue. So she recommended he take the A train to the Utica Avenue station near the north end of Albany Avenue. This brought him to the 1 block of Albany Avenue, but the grocery store was at 1520 Albany Avenue and was over 3 miles away, so he wasn't even close when he got off at this stop. But he wouldn't figure that out until after he actually got off at the stop. The area he would be getting off at was called Bedford-Stuyvesant, or Bed-Stuy for short. It's an area of Brooklyn that has experienced immense gentrification over the years, which has its own whole host of pros and cons. Gentrification is a topic way too complex to deep dive on this episode today, and it has a lot of negative consequences to the culture of a neighborhood and impacts on long-term residents. In short, housing costs can get skyrocketed, which can then cause long-term residents to be displaced, and long-term shops and small businesses can be run out in favor of bigger businesses or newer, trendier ones. Again, this is a huge oversimplification of the issue, but I wanted to at least mention it to frame the context. But one positive thing that can happen, is that the areas that do have high crime, some of the efforts to make the neighborhood more appealing to bring in a business or to bring in or up the price of real estate, there's a large effort to move crime out of those neighborhoods. Again, it's not a fix, and that's why I say because it's not like the people who are part of a drug trade just stop selling drugs. They just move, so it sort of moves a problem elsewhere. But the reason I mention all of this is just that the Bed-Stuy neighborhood today isn't as foreboding as it was back then. But in 2001, it definitely was. It was in the early stages of this gentrification, and they were getting some new shops, but there was parts of Bed-Stuy, particularly this block that he was going to be interacting with on Albany Avenue, that had a high level of drug and gang activity, and it was even dangerous for police to be over there. Detective Mike Prate, who worked Henryk's case, said in an article in the New York Times, quote, "I don't know if the World Trade Center falling down really affects the drug trade on Albany Avenue," end quote. Michelle Bryce was a long-term resident of Decatur Street, which is right immersed in that block, and the area where Henryk would soon find himself walking. In an article with WNYC.org, she said, quote, "The best time to walk between Fulton and Decatur is from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. Thereafter, you're on your own," end quote. And that's the true words spoken from someone who had lived on that block since 1959. In fact, in some of the peaks of the crime in that area in the early 90s, there used to be a phrase that described the area as Bed-Stuy, do or die. Henryk didn't know anything about this neighborhood. He just knew after stepping off the Utica Ave stop that he was lost. Witnesses reported seeing him walking around with a map in his hand. Not only had he gotten off at the wrong stop for where he truly needed to be, he also made a wrong turn. After getting off the subway, he began to walk west along Fulton Street toward Albany Avenue. At the intersection of Albany Avenue, Siwiak turned right, heading north instead of south. A wrong turn that would ultimately prove deadly for him. At roughly 11:40 p.m., residents of the area recounted hearing arguing followed by several gunshots. A woman living on nearby Decatur Street said she heard the gunshots but was too scared to look out her window. Henryk Siwiak had been shot at several times but hit once, a bullet to his lung. He staggered over to a stretch of row houses looking for somebody to help him. He got up the stairs to 119 Decatur Street and even had his bag hanging on the steps there. He rang the doorbell, but nobody would answer. The woman who lived there would later tell police that she was just too scared to open the door. He tried to make his way back down the stairs for more help at the next house, but he was mortally wounded. He collapsed face first into the ground and bled out. By the time authorities had arrived just moments later, Henryk Siwiak was dead. 9/11 had a huge impact on how this case was investigated. NYPD had every available officer working, and some were already well into overtime at this point. Resources were very much focused on Lower Manhattan. Normally, in the case of a homicide, cold case detective Mike Prate said that it would be an all-hands-on-deck situation. You bring out the crime scene unit to collect the forensic evidence, but they were all tied up, and the members were not available. Instead, they had to send out a forensic collection unit, which was used for things more like home break-ins, things that were not considered violent crimes, think more property crimes. According to Prate in an interview in 2011, he said, quote, Siwiak wasn't afforded the initial experts in processing the homicide scene. The police department gave the investigation what it could that day, end quote. Another detective shared this belief. He said that normally they would take multiple divisions to solve a homicide with limited witnesses and evidence, like in the event of this case. This includes the narcotics division, the gang division, and the vice division. They would all be out trying to shake out witnesses and find information and share that information with one another. But he said that all resources were being sent down to Lower Manhattan. Those at the scene were not able to collect much evidence of value. They were able to retrieve spent shell casings from a .40 caliber handgun, a gun that police have said that they haven't seen matched to any crime scenes in use of a commission in any crime after this one. In Siwiak's wallet, there was $75 in cash. Initially, this made police consider that robbery was not a motive, but Detective Prate said he felt it could have been a botched robbery and that Henryk's difficulty with English could have prevented him from understanding exactly what was going on in the interaction where perhaps a group of people came upon him and tried to rob him. Now, his sister Luciana believes he was targeted because of what he was wearing and his appearance. She thought with the military fatigues and his darker skin tone and darker hair that people may have thought he was Arab instead of Polish. And she said, quote, I think maybe it was a mistake. There were many angry people. Now, we do know that this was absolutely a thing that happened after 9/11. Hate crimes against Arabs and Muslims in post-9/11 America increased significantly. A team of sociologists at the University of Albany actually studied this and came to this conclusion. 9/11 created a climate in which many Americans felt united against a new enemy, and which acts of hatred against Arabs and Muslims became normalized behaviors. While statistically and anecdotally we know this was true, I personally am not sure it would have happened this fast. On the evening of 9/11, as a country, we were still just figuring out the bigger picture. The police tend not to buy into this theory either. Henryk's family also speculated that because of his appearance, he could have been killed by the police. There were many officers being brought into New York City and National Guardsmen. In fact, first responders first thought, based on the fatigues he was wearing, that he may have been a National Guardsman who was just brought in town to assist. His sister, Luciana, said that crime had stopped all over the city almost completely that evening. Now, I want to go back to what the detective said. He was like, yeah, that very much may have been the case, but I don't think you understand this avenue and this street corner, and the drug trade was not going to stop for anything. And so he, again, doesn't suspect this. But I want to say the exact quote that his sister Luciana said about this, just so you can understand her train of thought. So I'm going to read the exact quote to you, but she does speak broken English, just so you know, and I'm going to read it as a direct quote. She said, quote, I think you see, he was in this army jacket and pants. There were many policemen came from other states and probably met him and asked him. Maybe he was looking like Arab. He have ID in pocket. He never understood about police say, hand up. Maybe he went to explain and show ID and put his hand in his pocket and they shot him in this moment. End quote. So essentially, I get the sense that his sister believes that he may have not understood the question that a police officer was asking. They were saying, please show us some form of ID. They were possibly profiling him based on his appearance and thinking he could be a terrorist. And based on that, she's thinking that maybe when he went to go into his pocket and grab his ID, he was shot by police. but police dismissed this theory entirely. One detective who worked the case, Detective Joyce, said it was a unique caliber gun. He said if it was a cop, it definitely wasn't a cop's firearm. Some people have speculated that he may have just been caught in the crossfire of existing gang activity. The reason for this, and the reason people speculate this, is because they wondered how much he could have truly been arguing back and forth with someone with his limited English. So they suspected that maybe it was just 2 or more people involved in gang and drug activity that were arguing, and that he was just shot as part of it. But police largely ruled this theory out too, and I can understand why. For one, from a forensic and ballistics evidence standpoint, based on what was recovered from the shots fired, it appeared that all the shots were aimed in his direction and that just one fatal bullet hit him. But he was definitely the person they were intending to hit. It didn't appear that he was just caught in the crossfire. And as far as ruling out the arguing, nobody, at least nobody who has come forward, has said what the argument was about. And I think if you're thinking about like when you're just sitting in your own neighborhood, if you've ever heard arguing out on your street or you've heard arguing somewhere, it could just be that people are hearing raised voices. So the fact about the whole speaking English and that impact, I think it's way less significant than people are making it out to be. So the leading theory for the detective who worked the case the longest, and nowadays even when police are interviewed, is still just that it was a robbery gone wrong. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood for 3 full days after the shooting, but nobody was willing to come forward with any information. A few people who said they passed him on the street prior to the shooting just described him as the Polish man with fatigues on, which is interesting because, again, they were able to at least discern that he was Polish and not Arab, as the sister was saying. And it must be, I'm not sure if it's maybe because they spoke to him or maybe he asked for directions. The police have never come forward with any of the specifics in the interview, but they definitely knew this man was Polish. Now, one thing I could also say about that, though, is that they could have heard about his death in the newspapers and the news in the days followed and just referred to like, oh yeah, I know the man you're talking about, that Polish man. Yes, I did. I passed him. He had the fatigues on. So it's hard to say, but just some thoughts on that. Over the years, cold case detectives have tried to re-interview witnesses who have since moved away from that block, but it really hasn't come up with any success. They do feel, though, that there were several witnesses to the crime and that there are people who are still out there who know who did this. But thus far, a $12,000 reward has not enticed anybody to come forward. Detective Prate is now retired and the case is cold, but he still does interviews on the case and talks about how much it haunts him. I've watched his interviews and you can just tell it's a case that he can't let go, and you can tell how much he wants this solved. And he says he is confident it is going to be solved someday. He talked about how innocent of a victim Siwiak was. He said to ABC News, quote, "It's like bookends. They left in the morning, their family, and they did nothing else but show up for work. This man did nothing else other than go to work that night. That's what sticks in my mind all these years later," end quote. Henryk's family back in Poland was just absolutely shattered by their loss. Eva Siwiak said in an interview with ABC News that she was an emotional wreck after losing her husband of 20 years. She said, quote, "He was a loving husband and loving father. He loved making us happy. He loved teaching his son to ride bike or play chess. Loved helping me around the house. We were leading a modest but dignified life. For a certain period of time after the tragedy, I thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, that somebody stole my husband's documents and was murdered, and that my husband got lost somewhere, so I kept calling him to check when he will come home," end quote. Eva said that her son couldn't understand why someone would hurt his dad, and he blamed himself. He thought maybe because he sometimes misbehaved that his dad was killed as a punishment. His mother said to him, quote, "I told him it was because bad people attacked and killed many people in New York on this day, and other bad people the same day killed your father. He wasn't alone." Henryk's family has lost all hope that this will ever be solved. They said that if an American had been killed in Poland, the world would erupt with anger and that the ends of the earth would be moved to have it be solved. But Eva felt that because her husband was just a Polish immigrant in New York City who spoke broken English and worked under the table and was living in poverty, that nobody really cares. I will say that the NYPD officers and detectives who were interviewed for this case seemingly want to solve this terribly, but I understand why Eva feels the way she does, and I can understand her frustration. I hope for her sake and the sake of her family that she is proven wrong. Every year on 9/11, there are big memorial ceremonies happening all over New York City to commemorate all the tragic events that happened that day and all the people who laid down their life trying to save others, and to remember the heroes who served in 9/11 and all the people who tragically lost their life. And during those events, Henryk Siwiak's sister still attends and goes to them and goes to the church, even though she knows her brother's name will not be read amongst those people. And she just hopes that his name isn't forgotten and that someone has to answer for the crimes they committed, taking away this hardworking, loving father on that day. She has done this for 23 years. And 23 years is long enough to stay silent. If you witnessed something on that day, now is the time to come forward. The NYPD is still asking anyone with information to come forward because just one tip, even after all these years, could make a difference in solving this crime. Please contact 1-800-577-TIPS. That's 1-800-577-TIPS. Thank you for joining me for another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. I'll be back next Monday with another episode, so in the meantime, please follow me on social media at Simpler Time Crime Pod on Instagram and the Facebook page, A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast. Please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts and tell your friends. Thank you so much for listening.